Welcome to the deep dive. We are kicking things off today with a massive foundational question.
A really big one, yeah.
It's one of those questions that seems almost too big to even ask, let alone answer, which is what is the exact structure of world order?
Right. And traditionally, the way we answer that is just by looking at a map. You see states, you see borders, you look at military alliances and diplomacy. We sort of tend to think of the world as this giant chessboard where countries are the players moving the pieces around.
But let me pause you there, because when I look at the world you and I actually live in today, that chessboard analogy it feels pretty outdated.
Totally.
Think about our energy systems or global financial markets, the spread of AI infrastructure, semiconductor supply chains. These things absolutely do not care about borders. They flow right across them.
They do.
And honestly, they often change the world faster than any single government can even draft a press release to react to them.
Which tells us that the old map simply isn't an accurate representation of reality anymore. The pieces are moving themselves and they're completely ignoring the squares on the board.
Exactly. So to figure out what the new map actually looks like, we're exploring a really fascinating stack of research today. At the center of it is a framework from a series of documents known as the GOA-23, which stands for Global Order Architecture.
And alongside that, we have their associated research notes, these really detailed global stress maps, and an analytical tool they call the LMOS.
Right, so our mission for this deep dive is to explore a wild new hypothesis from this architecture framework. And the hypothesis is this: world order is not the arrangement of states, it is the distribution of stress across multiple civilizational membranes.
And I know civilizational membrane sounds a bit abstract, maybe even a little sci-fi.
A little matrixy, yeah?
Yeah, but what is so fascinating here is how incredibly practical this framework is for you, the listener. Because by shifting your perspective from states to membranes, you're going to gain a completely new, vastly less overwhelming way to read the news.
Oh, absolutely.
Instead of drowning in chaotic daily events, you'll start seeing the underlying structure of why things happen.
It fundamentally shifts how I'm going to look at global events from now on. So let's unpack the first big idea from the GOA-23 framework, the failing state model.
Right.
For centuries, international politics has relied on three basic assumptions. You have state sovereignty, territorial borders, and political authority. You draw a line in the sand, you say, this is my country, and you make the rules inside that line.
But the research points out the glaring limits of that model today. Take the financial markets or the internet or the incredibly complex supply chains required to build a single microchip. Where do those actually exist?
They don't.
Right. They don't exist inside one state. They are networks operating across dozens of borders simultaneously.
But wait, hasn't geopolitics always been about outside forces? Countries have traded across borders and dealt with international economic pressures for centuries. How is this any different from, say, old school 19th century trade?
Well, it's a matter of scale, speed, and ultimately authority. In the 19th century, the state was still the primary architect of those trade routes. The state built the navies, chartered the companies, they dictated the terms. What the global order architecture documents suggest is that today, the systems have outgrown the states.
I see.
The systems dictate terms to the governments, not the other way around. If you look at the framework they're building here, states are merely nodes within much larger networks. They don't run the system. They're just geographical points where different global networks intersect.
And this brings us to the core concept of today's deep dive, the world membrane model. This completely reframes everything. Instead of one single world order where countries are just jostling for position, the world is actually made up of overlapping layers, or membranes.
Yes, and the framework explicitly defines 5 key membranes that shape our modern civilization.
Let's go through them.
First, you have the resource membrane. This is the physical lifeblood of the world, the flow of energy, minerals, food, moving through pipelines and on cargo ships. Second is the financial membrane, which handles currencies, capital flows, and the massive web of global debt.
Third is the technological membrane. This is the big one dominating the headlines right now, right? Data centers, AI models, semiconductor fabs, subsea, fiber optic cables.
Exactly. And fourth is the security membrane, dealing with military power, intelligence networks, and deterrence. And finally, the fifth is the cultural membrane, which holds our values, norms, religious beliefs, and social institutions.
And here is the crucial detail from the notes. Each of these membranes has its own internal rules, its own speed, and its own dynamics. Capital flowing through the financial membrane moves in milliseconds via algorithms.
Right. While energy flowing through the resource membrane moves at the speed of an oil tanker crossing the ocean.
So, if I'm picturing this correctly, what does this mean for the countries on our old world map? Because this was a huge realization for me as I read through the stack. States only exist where these membranes intersect.
Yes.
The country you live in is just a node. It's a specific location where the resource, financial, tech, security, and cultural membranes all overlap. State decisions do not shape the membranes. The dynamics of the membranes shape the state.
It's a complete inversion of how we are taught to view history and politics. I mean, the state isn't the master of its domain. It is merely a manager of the flows passing through it.
Yeah.
A government is just trying to regulate the pressure of the pipes running through its territory.
Which naturally leads us to the next massive concept in the research. Stress. Because these flows aren't always smooth. Sometimes the pipes get clogged or the pressure spikes.
Exactly. Every single membrane is constantly experiencing stress. Think about fluctuating energy prices hitting the resource membrane, or intense AI competition hitting the tech membrane, or sudden demographic changes hitting the cultural membrane. All of these things modify the tension inside those specific layers.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this. So if a country's economy suddenly crashes, I shouldn't just look at the country's specific domestic policies. I should be looking at the tension within the global financial membrane.
Precisely. And that brings us to a massive perspective shift on how we view historical events. When we think of a war, a financial crisis, or a sudden change in government, we usually treat that event as a cause. We say the 2008 financial crisis caused the economy to change. But the membrane model says no. Events are not causes.
They use the analogy of an earthquake in the notes, which grounds this perfectly, I think. You don't blame the earthquake for the tectonic plates shifting. That makes zero sense.
Right.
The plates have been grinding together, building up invisible stress deep underground for decades. The earthquake is just the visible release of that accumulated stress.
That's the exact mechanism at play here. Wars, revolutions, and market crashes are just the visible release of invisible membrane stress. The event itself is just the moment the membrane finally ruptured because it couldn't hold the tension anymore.
So how do these membranes actually deform before they break? Because if we can spot the deformation, we can see the earthquake coming, right?
That's the goal.
The GOA-23 documents outline 3 specific forms of membrane deformation. The first one is called speed differential, or shear.
And this one is incredibly relevant right now. The researchers point out that the financial and technological membranes operate at extreme speeds. AI development, algorithmic trading, global data transfers, these happen in daily cycles, sometimes seconds or even milliseconds, but political and cultural systems,
Oh, they're so slow.
incredibly slow. They move in annual budget cycles, 4-year election cycles, or even generational shifts.
So you have these incredibly fast layers pulling against incredibly slow layers. The text calls this structural shear. It's like trying to drive a car where the front wheels are going 100 miles an hour and the back wheels are going 10.
Right? That friction between the fast tech and the slow politics generates immense instability. The car is literally going to tear itself apart.
Yeah. And the second form of deformation is calcification.
This happens when institutions or societies simply stop responding to structural pressure. The debate slows down, adjustments fail, reforms stall entirely. In this state, the membrane essentially becomes rigid. And as we know from basic physics, a rigid structure under pressure is the most likely to snap.
Like a massive bureaucracy that is so tied up in red tape that it literally cannot build new energy infrastructure. Even when the resource membrane is screaming for it, it just becomes brittle.
Exactly. And then the third deformation is compatibility errors.
This is such a fascinating way to describe what happens when a global system meets a local reality. The documents explain that global decision-making often relies on what they call a global operating system, things like market logic, technocratic policy, or standardized corporate governance.
But local societies run on a completely different operating system. They run on history, religion, and community structures.
I loved the example implied in the research here. Imagine a global technocratic climate policy, say a perfectly standardized ESG mandate designed in a corporate headquarters somewhere. That's the global operating system. But then you try to apply that mandate to a local generational farming community in a developing nation.
Right, and when those two operating systems collide, You get a compatibility error. The policy that looks perfectly rational and brilliant on a spreadsheet completely stalls or fails in actual practice. It's literally a software crash in the real world.
So you have these three deformations: the shear of different speeds, the calcification of rigid institutions, and the compatibility errors of colliding cultures. All of them are building stress right now.
Okay, let's test drive this model, because the documents actually apply this framework to the past to show how powerful it is. And we really should spend a minute here because it completely changes how you read civilizational history.
Yeah, it does.
We are taught in school that the age of exploration was about European naval states suddenly rising to power through sheer willpower and statecraft.
But the global order architecture framework says no, the state was just the node. What was actually happening was the expansion of the maritime membrane. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation changed the flow of global resources. The states that happened to sit at the geographic edge of that new membrane, like Britain, Spain, and Portugal, were shaped and elevated by the membrane's expansion.
And the Industrial Revolution. That wasn't just a clever British invention. It was a fundamental transformation of the global energy membrane. The shift to coal and steam moved the center of global power away from the Mediterranean and toward Northern Europe. The state didn't dictate the power shift. The energy membrane did.
Even the rise of the 20th century dollar system wasn't just brilliant American post-war policy, it was the ultimate concentration of the financial membrane. The Bretton Woods system was the membrane solidifying around a specific node. In this view, history is not simply the rise and fall of states. It is the continuous transformation of membrane configurations.
It makes history feel so much more structural.
It really does, but it also raises a really logical question. I mean, if there is so much structural stress in these overlapping membranes right now, with AI, energy, and finance all pulling in different directions, why hasn't the world collapsed already? Why aren't we seeing earthquakes every single day?
Right, it's the puzzle of silence. And the text answers this with a concept called the layer of silence. The reason things haven't ruptured everywhere all at once is because other systems absorb the pressure.
Like shock absorbers.
Exactly. Think of it like the shock absorbers on that car we mentioned earlier. Markets absorb financial shocks by repricing assets. Political systems delay direct confrontations through diplomacy. Societies maintain their daily inertia. People still wake up, go to work, and buy groceries. The stress spreads out across multiple systems.
But the research offers a pretty stark warning here. Silence is not stability. Just because the shock absorbers are working doesn't mean the road isn't destroying the car. The text notes that our current global moment is either a phase of continued absorption or we are rapidly approaching structural thresholds where the membranes simply can't absorb anymore.
And to really understand the gravity of that, we should look at the progression of these GOA documents to ground the listener. This isn't just an isolated theory, it's part of a developing multi-year research framework.
Right, let's trace that path. Earlier in the series, GOA-21 looked at how institutions need to adapt to the increasing frequency of global disturbances. They called it institutional redesign. Then, GOA-22 introduced a massive shift, the transition to a network civilization. That document argued the world is moving away from a model of physical ownership toward a model of permission and digital access.
And now, GOA-23 takes that network civilization and adds the physics of stress to it. It proposes the shift toward a membrane civilization. It's the realization that states are no longer the ultimate sovereign units. They increasingly function just as membrane management nodes.
Which brings us to where we are right now today. The sources declare that in the 21st century, we're not dealing with a single Cold War structure or a simple unipolar world dominated by one superpower. We are living in a multi-membrane stress era.
This is a crucial distinction. In the past, you might have one primary stress point, say a nuclear standoff in the security membrane. Today, AI development, energy flows, global finance, and semiconductor supply chains are all under extremely high stress simultaneously.
And the documents actually provide a global stress map that points out the exact stress nodes where these membranes are currently crashing into each other. It is wild to look at the world map this way, stripping away the country borders and just looking at the heat signatures of membrane friction.
Let's take the listener on a quick tour of that map. According to the research, the single biggest intersection of stress in the world right now is Taiwan.
Yeah, the text is very clear on this. Taiwan is the ultimate stress node. Why? Because it's where the technology membrane, the AI membrane, and the security membrane all violently intersect. It is the absolute epicenter of the advanced semiconductor supply chain. Those chips fuel the global AI race, and whoever controls the AI race dictates global security. The stress converging on that one tiny island is unprecedented.
Then you have what the map calls the bottleneck, the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. This is the critical intersection of the resource membrane, specifically global energy flows, and the security membrane. A massive percentage of the world's oil flows through a channel just a few miles wide. Any stress there immediately sends shear forces tearing through the global financial membrane.
And finally, the map points to the U.S. as the massive node bearing the weight of the financial and AI membranes. You have the entire globe's reliance on the dollar system overlapping directly with the push for absolute AI dominance.
So if you are looking at this map, you aren't looking at countries competing. You're looking at these specific geographical locations vibrating with the accumulated stress of overlapping global flows.
Okay, this is all fascinating theory, but how do we actually use this? If you're listening to this and trying to apply it to your daily life to avoid info overload when you turn on the news, what's the practical application?
Well, the researchers provide an incredibly practical set of tools for this. First is the SCWS, the Stress Early Warning System. And that works alongside an analytical framework called the LMOS, which stands for Layered Media Operations System.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah, and the core instruction of both these tools is simple. Stop getting caught up in the narrative layer of the news.
Yes, let's break down the LMOS framework because it's brilliant. It divides all the information you consume into 3 layers. First is the N layer, the narrative. These are the slogans, the political speeches, the press releases, the media spin. Below that is the I layer, the intention. This is what a government or corporation actually values or wants to achieve. But the layer you really need to watch is the OS layer, the operational system.
Exactly. Don't watch what politicians are saying in the narrative layer. Watch the leading indicators of structural stress in the operational system. The Stress Early Warning System tells us to look at hard data. Watch Brent crude prices to understand the tension in the resource membrane. Watch 10-year Treasury yield rates for the financial membrane.
Track GPU supply shortages and export controls for the tech membrane.
Right. Those operational realities tell you where the stress is actually building, long before the political narrative even catches up to it.
And there's one rule in the LMOS framework that is incredibly useful for navigating social media and the 24-hour news cycle. They call it emotion as gradient.
This might be the most counterintuitive piece of advice in the stack. Often when we see a news commentator, a politician, or an analyst showing extreme emotion, anger, fear, heavy bias, we tend to just dismiss them as being irrational or spinning a narrative.
Right. We just think, oh, they're just trying to get clicks. I'm ignoring them. But the research says do not dismiss them. View their emotion as a sensor. Treat them like a thermometer on a dashboard. It's like looking at a car engine. You don't get mad at the dashboard thermometer for flashing red. You recognize that the engine is overheating.
When someone is expressing intense fear or anger about a policy, their bias is revealing exactly where the membrane tension is highest. They are a localized sensor reacting to the heat of the stress friction.
It completely reframes the noise of the media. You don't have to agree with the shouting, you just have to recognize that the shouting means a membrane is pulling too tight in that specific area. The emotion is the gradient of the stress.
That's such a useful tool.
So what does this all mean? Let's pull this all together. By looking at the world as a series of overlapping membranes, finance, tech, resources, security, culture, rather than just a map of color and countries, you can actually spot the invisible stress accumulating before a rupture happens.
You stop being surprised by the earthquakes of history because you've been watching the tectonic plates the whole time. You know where the fault lines are.
It is the ultimate shortcut to being truly well-informed. You can filter out the daily political noise, ignore the narrative layer, and focus on the operational realities, the supply chains, the bond yields, the speed differentials. You start reading the matrix of the world.
And this raises a profound implication. If this membrane model is correct, if states are no longer the ultimate masters of their domains, but are merely nodes desperately responding to the pressure of these massive, overlapping global networks.
It shifts everything about how we view power, right?
It does. It forces us to ask, if the state isn't in charge of the system, what is? And here is something to consider for you that isn't explicitly laid out in the research, but feels like the inevitable conclusion. If global membranes dictate the actions of the state, and high-speed algorithms increasingly dictate the tech and financial membranes, it begs the question of human agency.
Wow. If algorithms are managing the stress flows faster than human politics can even register them, how much longer until we realize we aren't voting for our true leaders anymore? We might just be voting for the middle management of a machine we can't control. Something to think about next time you head to the ballot box. So next time a breaking news alert pops up on your phone, don't just ask what happened, ask yourself which membrane just released its stress. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.